FDR came in, he knew exactly what had happened, and that Wall Street was responsible 100% for the Great Depression. In his first 100 days, he was focused on one thing: creating legislation to stop this from ever happening again. It was all done. The notional value of the derivatives traded on the mortgages, it was $680 trillion that nobody realized how big it was because it was unregulated. Go back and look at Graham Leach Bliley. Everybody voted for that. They don't pass any bills that don't help the wealthy.
Hey everybody, this is Paul with the Curators, and I am here with a special guest, Barry Ellsworth. Barry, great to see you today.
Paul, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. And I have, Barry is an author of this book, Wall Street, War on America, and its attack on affordable housing. I've just been going through this book over the weekend, Barry, and turns out you and I seem to have a lot in common, especially how we view the world. I think you have a really good historical perspective on things, and I really love your take on the history and how lessons of the past can be applied to the present if we choose to apply them, right? And I think there's a big question as to whether we've really learned those lessons or not, but we'll get into that. I'd like to start out by asking you, just to let our audience know, what have you been doing that in your career that led you to this point?
Well, I see things because of my past experience that other people don't see, and it just kind of drives me crazy. I was raised or born in Utah, and then I became a stockbroker in the 1980s. And most people now, if you're not, close to our age, Utah used to be known as the penny stock capital of the world.
Right.
And they changed the laws, I believe it was in 86, 87. And so it's not the penny stock capital of the world anymore. But back then, there was a stock exchange, a regional stock exchange called the Intermountain Stock Exchange. And it was still in existence. Back in the 50s, that exchange actually traded more shares every day than the New York Stock Exchange during the uranium craze. I can remember there was a record day of 88 million shares. That's how different it was. And this time the Dow would go from between 650 and 850 and then back down. It was like watching paint dry. But what I learned at the Penny House were all these promoters. And it was like becoming a stockbroker in the 1920s in Utah and how they manipulated things. That's why I became so upset when, the housing crisis, and then everybody gets on and said that Graham Leach Bliley, which is the act that did away with all of FDR's protections, it caused it, but everybody said it didn't. So that's how I got the background. I learned how to manipulate stocks from watching promoters do it.
So back in the 20s, they didn't have these regulations. It was sort of a Wild West approach to markets, right? And a lot of people were getting screwed over that didn't know they were getting screwed over. Now, after the crash of 29, FDR comes in, and through his administration shortly, and really the market didn't bottom until 32, right? It took several years. There was a substantial decline between the crash and the subsequent bottom a few years later. And then FDR comes in with the Glass-Steagall Act, which basically puts up a wall between banking and brokerage firms and doesn't allow brokerage firms to get into the banking business. What I'm trying to do here is give people an understanding of the history, why this Glass-Steagall Act was put into place, and then what led over time to its repeal in the late 90s, or I think it was 99. And why was it repealed? And why did we think it would be any different than it was then? Because we know that the housing crisis was at least in part a consequence of the repeal of Glass-Steagall. So I'm trying to get people to understand the importance of this because it really comes into play today in our society.
What happened in the 1920s is they formed buying syndicates. Okay, Charles Mitchell, he was the head of what became Citibank, and there were all these promoters. Joseph Kennedy was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, I mentioned it, but I don't think that they perhaps understood what was going to happen because there was a confluence of events that occurred. There was the ticker tape, telephones, radio, movies. Okay, movies just started the silent films, and then the talkies came. So there were celebrities, movie stars, and radio stars in the ticker tape. What it did was, there's no space now between Wall Street quotes and somebody in California, and all of these things happen together, and these stock promoters were just promoting the crap out of all of these stocks to people all across the country. There were no laws or regulations. There was no SEC. There was nothing rule-wise when it came to stocks, except a few blue sky laws. So what they did was not illegal. When you buy all of this stock in secret, and the transfer agent, you're just taking the stock certificate. You're not sending it to the transfer agent to have it transferred into your name. So it still appeared that there were thousands and thousands of shareholders. But the majority of that stock was sitting in a safety deposit box because they had people all over the country buying stock like this, plus the specialists on the New York Stock Exchange.
And so tell us about the military-industrial complex.
Well, J.P. Morgan Sr., he did it. He was the one that first started the funding wars. In the Civil War, there was a thing that was called the Hall's carbine, like a carbine rifle affair. He bought 5,000 rifles for $2.50 or $3.50. And then he sold them for $22.50 to the Union Army. And it was a big scandal because it was war profiteering.
Mm-hmm.
And that started it. And then, but his son, J.P. Morgan, who was the head of J.P. Morgan during World War I and all of that, he loaned Russia, Great Britain and France were some of the group that fought Germany in World War I. He loaned Russia $12 million. Then he got a contract for him personally with France and Great Britain. He was their sole agent to purchase all armaments and supplies during the war. He got 1% on everything that was sold to them. He also got brokerage commissions for putting it together. He went and put a 2,200 bank consortium together, and they loaned Great Britain and France $500 million to fight World War I. And that's, to me, that's the beginning of the military-industrial complex. And since that time, there has never been a war that J.P. Morgan, now J.P. Morgan Chase, doesn't want to fund. I know a lot of people think that the Federal Reserve Bank is the U.S. Treasury. It's not. It is a private bank, owned by private people.
Mm-hmm.
And
unelected.
And there's 35.
None of whom have been elected, but who directly control a lot of what happens in people's daily lives.
The other thing I started to talk about too that caused the depression was back then the margin accounts where you could borrow the money in the stock to buy stock that nowadays is only 50%. Back then it was 90%.
Right.
Okay. So you could buy if you wanted to buy $25,000 worth of stock, and let's say RCA was trading at 25 in the 1925 perhaps.
Yeah.
You only had to put up $2,500 of your own money to buy the 25,000, and you could borrow the $22,500 from the bank. That's what a margin account is.
A 10% decline would do what?
A 10% decline, your loss would be, the loss is from 25,000. So a 10% decline would, you lost 2,500.
Your entire investment.
Your entire investment, your part, okay, that you put up for money. But if you hang, but what happened, they manipulated the stocks for 10 years. It was like what they did in the housing market here, because they really started manipulating the housing market in the 90s. Las Vegas was the fastest growing city in the United States for 19 years. And I know when they started bundling the mortgages, because in 1995, my cousin, who was on the board of directors at Dean Witter at the time, and I'll say this now because he's passed, he was one of the first people bundling them. And he was living in Arizona, and I called him, I said, wait a minute, how can you bundle mortgages? And he said, what do you mean? I said, I'm doing like $5 million a piece. I said, the basis of U.S. law comes from English common law. As soon as you securitize, if you're bundling mortgages together, the reason we have title insurance is to prove that there's clean title. Who owns that property? And what title insurance does, or title companies do, they go and make sure that there's no encumbrances or liens on the property when you buy it, so you get clear title. If you're bundling securities and now you're slicing and dicing them, you've got 10,000 mortgages put together, and you create a bond that you sell those bonds to other people, and the payments from the mortgages are how they're going to make their money. You just lost clear title. Right. Who owns those mortgages? And he said, I don't know. I leave that to the lawyers. But it was Eric Holder, who was Obama's attorney general. He was actually a partner at the company that wrote the opinion letter that said that's okay. It wasn't okay. But that's what they did.
Let's bring this into the time when, the likes of Sandy Weil were involved, and there was the attempted merger of his bank with an insurance company. I know because I was at Payne Weber in 1999, and there was a deal on the table for UBS, which was a bank at the time, Union Bank of Switzerland, to buy Payne Weber. So now we're getting all this, and there was a board seat awaiting Phil Gramm if he was part of the group that passed the legislation to repeal Glass-Steagall, replace it with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which had Graham's name on it, of course. And Clinton was president. This was a bipartisan kind of decision to abandon the guardrails of Glass-Steagall, right?
What happened is, after the crash in 1929, Hubert Hoover was president, and he didn't do anything. He blamed the Depression on Mexican migrant workers. He sent 1.5 million to 2.5 million Mexicans. Half of them didn't speak Spanish. They were born in America. They were American citizens. He sent them back to Mexico. That's all he did. And he had a meeting with some business leaders and asked them if they do some construction projects. So he didn't do anything to stop what Wall Street had done that caused the Great Depression. Then there was another election in 1932, and FDR won. FDR came in, he knew exactly what had happened, and that Wall Street was responsible 100% for the Great Depression. In his first 100 days, he was focused on one thing: creating legislation to stop this from ever happening again. And to help him, he created the Securities and Exchange Commission, and he asked Joseph Kennedy Sr. to be the first commissioner. He had him write the detailed rules and regulations because Joe Kennedy was one of the stock promoters that caused the Great Depression. He did Kennedy a huge favor because he made him look like one of the good guys. And Kennedy did a good job, but FDR knew without a shadow of a doubt, because his family had money. He was also the governor of New York during the time. He knew what had caused it. The first Glass-Steagall Act that Hoover wrote or had written is all it did. It didn't do anything to protect Americans from Wall Street. It let, before that, it was the gold standard. What it allowed people to do is they lost so much money. The first Glass-Steagall Act let the Federal Reserve print paper money that wasn't backed by gold. It was backed by the full taxing authority of the U.S. government. So T-bills, notes, under 10 years than the long 30-year note, tax anticipation notes, any federal paper that would back the paper currency that is now they're going to print without the gold backing. So FDR, I'm making a guess here, but I'm 99% sure I'm right. Joseph Kennedy wrote all the detailed rules for the Securities Act of 33 and the one of 34. The 34 is more about the exchanges. The 33 Act was about transparency. Who owns what? Okay, your wife can't own your stock but you really own it, or your next door neighbor can't. You have to declare who owns what. Mm-hmm. And he understood it so well. Kennedy redid the Glass-Steagall Act, and the magic of Glass-Steagall was this: if you are a officer or director in a brokerage firm, a New York investment house that deals in stocks, options, bonds, riskier stuff, you cannot be an officer and director in a commercial bank where they separated it, where people put their paychecks every week. They borrow money to mortgages, personal loans. They couldn't be an officer and director, so they had no access to the citizens of the United States deposits. Zero. Sure. And that simple line put a wall that was 100 feet wide between everyday working people's money and Wall Street.
So now let's bring this. What I'm trying to do here is get people to understand today, like what this means to them, right? So let's bring this to the 2006, 2007 period where we had these ninja loans, no income, no job, automatic loan granting from
the liar loans, yeah.
The Wall Street basically has now, because Glass-Steagall has been repealed, Wall Street kind of commandeers the whole mortgage market, and people are given loans that the Wall Street firms know are going to end up being worthless, but people who see the value of real estate going up and are saying, I have to buy a home because if I don't do it now, I'll never be able to afford one. And so it's not to say that they should have done that, because they need to know that, if I'm taking a loan, I need to be able to repay it. So I think there's culpability on both sides, Barry. And when the shit hit the fan and the Federal Reserve had to come in and they had to do TARP, Trouble Asset Relief Program, and bail out these banks, nobody on Wall Street even got so much as a slap on the wrist, right? Nobody in the banking system. Oh. They were telling Hank Paulson and the Treasury how much money they needed to keep the system afloat. Now, at the very least, couldn't they have said, okay, we're going to bail you out, but here's what's going to happen. You you, head of Bank America, head of JP Morgan, head of Wells Fargo, you guys are never, Goldman Sachs, whomever, you guys are never going to work in Wall Street again or in a bank again. You guys are out because you really helped create this problem. And they threw Lehman Brothers out there as a sacrificial lamb, didn't they? Right?
Yeah, they did.
Uh, just
And
to
I
kind
think
of
that was perfect.
that was what?
Well, I think there was probably personal stuff going on there that
Sure.
we don't know about. But that's why
Right.
it happened. And I think it was between Jamie Dimon and the head of Lehman Brothers.
Yeah, Dick Fuld, yeah. So that happened in 2008, 2009. There was never any real serious discussion about reinstituting Glass-Steagall. Instead, the MO became, well, instead of reinstituting Glass-Steagall, we've come too far to go back to Glass-Steagall. So what we're going to do instead is we're just going to rely on this sort of money printing spigot at the Fed anytime some potential crisis arises or we see dark storm clouds on the horizon. We always know that because we have the world's reserve currency, we have the privilege of being able to print money. We can do it, therefore we're going to do it. Not without real regard to the long-term implications of it. That's what I've come to see. Something that you had mentioned earlier when we were talking offline is how do you get people to see it unless there's enough pain in their lives where, can we alert people to this notion that there's these storm clouds really are building in a very, I'm pleading with people. These are very serious storm clouds brewing from a fiscal standpoint, from a monetary standpoint. And we see the measure, we can measure it in terms of poverty, right? And the increasing wealth gap. We're starting to see these things pretty front and center in our world, even though the media wants to paint a different picture and what the White House wants to tell us the economy is good. But in reality, we know that people are being gaslit and things are very difficult and it's getting worse. And this is where I want people to understand these lessons of history that you have such great experience in, understanding what is likely to happen today if we don't, as an electorate, get our arms around this and start to challenge the two-party system that is just prioritizing their own power and profit over the will of the people, right? This is kind of where I'm trying to go with our message here, and I know you have a lot to add there. So, what do you think?
Do you want me to go back and fast explain Sandy Will and Gerald Ford?
Yes.
Okay. Let me go back to 1999 and explain how Glass-Steagall got destroyed. And understand, it worked for 70 years. It protected Americans. So along comes a guy named Sandy Will. And don't get me wrong, Sandy Will is one of the smartest people
Yes, he is.
On Wall Street. He's a genius. And
Cornell Medical
he's a
Center.
great businessman, but he's a wonderful man.
Mm-hmm.
And he's smart. But what he did was he put travelers together, which owned all kinds of insurance companies, brokerage houses. It was a behemoth. And then he did merge that in 1998 with Citibank.
Yeah.
The problem was that violated Glass-Steagall. If FDR would have been president, I promise you, he would have said, this is not holding. You're going to break this up. You are not doing this, or you're going to face jail time. It's up to you. Mm-hmm. But we are not letting Wall Street back into the commercial banking system or to have access to our insurance money. It's not happening because he understood their addiction, that these people were sick. There are certain people that can't help. They're thieves. They're criminals. Okay. He understood that, but we didn't have that. We had Bill Clinton. And what Sandy Will did is he hurried and ran out and he got Gerald Ford, a Republican president, and he got Robert Rubin, who was Clinton's first Treasury Secretary,
Right.
put him on the boards of Travelers and paid him ungodly sums of money. Okay, he bribed them, and they were happy for the millions and millions and millions that he was giving them. He said, "Go out and get both sides of Congress to get on board with this and to pass the legislation that I'm going to have written." And he wrote what became known as Gramm-Leach-Bliley. It was really the Financial Services Modernization Act. There was nothing modern about it. It destroyed all of the protections FDR had put in place. And the next year they passed the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. Who would think that a bill named that would have anything to do with mortgages or banking? But it did. Those two bills combined, it recreated the environment that existed in the 1920s. It recreated a completely unregulated environment for Wall Street to play in within our commercial banking system. So even the SEC, no one had authority to regulate it. And that's what happened with the liar loans. Because yes, there's culpability on both sides, but I remember here in Las Vegas, you had to stand in front, okay, out front when they were releasing a new housing division. If you wanted to buy one of those homes, you had to be out front at 6 o'clock in the morning, standing in line, and people were buying 1, 2, 10, 20 homes at a time, okay, to get it, because it was just going crazy. But if the liar loans, what they were is anybody could buy one. If you were a valet at one of the hotels here and you wanted to buy $1 million home plus 10 more to rent to your friends, you just walk in and say, I make $50,000. I make $75,000 a month. Nobody checked anything. So the amount of debt that was created, when it was all done, the notional value of the derivatives traded on the mortgages was 689, I think, trillion. The only thing I'm thinking about was at 89 or 83. It was $680 trillion that nobody realized how big it was because it was unregulated.
That's not just fractional reserve banking. That's fractional reserve banking on like multiple steroids, right? Where
yes, it was insane. And they were doing it because every time they traded this stuff, they got hundreds of millions in fees. I started one of the largest ethanol companies in the world at one time because it would bought all of these ethanol plants from Verison and that. It was the second largest in the world. I didn't make it that big. Wayne Huvestal and Todd Becker did. But I started the company, and the reason they were able to do that is because where I put the first two plants. I built it in the cheapest corn in the United States. So as soon as they were done, I was the low-cost producer in the country, buying corn at 26 cents a bushel, less than the closest competitors in Nebraska. They're on the west side of the Missouri River. That's all irrigated corn. On the east side of the Missouri, which is where I put the plants, it's all rainfall. So that allowed them to keep that, the company kept its head above water. Here's what I say why they were thieves. There was a kid from Credit Suisse. I had $100 million in cash that I'd raised from stockholders to build the two plants. There was a kid from Credit Suisse that was calling me 4 or 5 times a week. So, but I have a product that's AAA rated for yielding 7.75%. I had the $100 million in government square fund from Goldman Sachs. It was only paying me $375, but it was government paper. It was T-bills, notes. The riskiest stuff in there was a couple of repo agreements, and there were only a few of those. So I wanted the security, not 4 points more in risk. After 3 weeks of him calling, 2 weeks, I said, just send me a prospectus, because I don't want to make anybody angry at the banks if I need to raise money in the future. He sent it to me. It took me 5 minutes to figure out this was complete garbage. It was CDOs, and a lot of it was subprime. They were worse than the real estate deals that Prudential Base tried to get us to sell. The last year I worked at Prudential Base as a broker, just wouldn't do it. You know, they were stealing all the money being made in fees. Anyway, there were two other large, I called him up and gave him a 5-minute talk. If you care at all about your clients, don't sell this stuff to them, because it's going to end up really bad. I don't know if that did any good or not. For all I know, he was part of the scam and he knew what he was selling. But there were two other large ethanol companies, Verisun, which they were both roll-ups, and Aventine. In 2008, they both went bankrupt because their CFOs had put $330 million at Verisun, $220 million at Aventine into these CDOs.
Right. Right.
And if it only took me 5 minutes to figure out they were trash, don't tell me Hank Paulson, the other people on top running those things, they knew they were selling trash. They were committing fraud intentionally. Plus, they were paying off the rating agencies to say that they were AAA. How much more criminal can you get?
That's right. So you have the rating agencies in your pocket. You have all yes men on the board of directors, right? Or women. You line their pockets. You get them to do whatever either legislation or backroom deals need to get done for your agenda to be fulfilled. And it also speaks to the idea, Barry, that these CFOs who, you know, you'd like to think that they're really, really sharp and on the ball, right? But you have a Wall Street background, so you understand the motivation, the product, you know, what really drives this stuff. And so you can smell a rat, you know. These CFOs, they may come in with the book knowledge and the intellect, but they could be just as gullible, perhaps even more so, because they think, you know, they're able to handle these large sums of money, and they are susceptible to these products that, you know, really, I would imagine that some shareholders of those companies were mighty unhappy and perhaps even sought legal action. I don't know. I'm guessing.
Well, there was one company or country, Iceland or Greenland, Iceland, I think, they rounded all their bankers up and they put them in jail.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
they nationalized the banks, and they've been doing wonderfully. Barack Obama put the thieves in, they made him Treasury Secretary. They put him in the highest positions in government. They
Right.
did nothing to them. And what Sandy Will, if you go to the 99, when Gerald Ford and those guys went out, they corrupted all of Congress, and they are still corrupt. The same people are still running Wall Street, and the same people are in Congress. That's the problem we've got. They only pass bills nowadays that help this criminal organization that's been running the country ever since. And part of it's the industrial military complex. I mean, that's why I like how we met was through Bobby Kennedy. Mm-hmm. I was excited to see him finally talking about going after the military industrial complex. And I know his history from what he's done with food, how he could solve the food problem at the FDA and the USDA. My little brother is dead in part because of OxyContin. It got him strung out on the stuff. Okay, so
I did not know that. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Oh, it was hard. I miss him all the time. I want to call him and just talk to him. But and after that, you know, Trump came in and said he was going to drain the swamp, but he put John Gottlieb in to run the FDA. All he did was make it easier to get the drugs through, and then he quit after 2 years. Once he got the whole system set up to get the drugs through more quickly, he quit, and in less than 90 days, he was on the board of directors of Pfizer. He basically handed them $100 billion gift and said, here, I'll show you how to get it through faster than anybody else. And
you know what I learned, Barry? Every good lobby has a revolving door.
Yes. And
right?
Yeah. And the problem is nowadays that I see, because my mind can't help but see it, they are manipulating home prices the same way they manipulated the stocks.
So
when
talk
you own
about
all
this.
The stock,
Yeah, the same thing. I get that. I'm going to ask the question and then please continue. But,
Okay.
Bobby Kennedy talks about this in terms of BlackRock and State Street and Fidelity and Vanguard buying up all the homes. And people don't understand what that means and how there's this movement toward feudalizing Americans and turning everyone into renters. And once that happens and we lose the fundamental concept of home equity in our communities, we start to become more like, I want to use the term slaves, prisoners in our communities than we do active members and participants in those communities. So, talk about that in terms of BlackRock's role. I know you've seen that lately. You're experiencing it in where you live and in other neighboring states. So, please continue with that. Thank you.
If people don't feel distress, okay, if you're not hurting, people don't pay attention to things.
Right.
And these guys are lying about how many homes they own. Blackstone is BlackRock is the largest uh, fund manager in the world, $11 trillion in assets. Blackstone is $1 trillion in assets. These numbers, I can't even get my mind around $1 trillion, but they're the ones buying, and then they act like they don't have a lot of them. Blackstone purchased Tricon in January of this year. Tricon's a Canadian company that had, I believe, 59,000 or 69,000 homes already. They are building, if you go to Tricon, Tricon, and look at residential, go over on the right side of the menu and it says communities. They are building homes to rent, not to sell,
Right.
to rent in 26 different locations. Starwood is doing it. You know, Starwood Hotels and that. Everybody's buying homes. Here's the danger of it, okay? Two quick stories. A week ago, a friend of mine called me that's been my friend for 35 years, met him in 12-step programs. He said, Barry, I sold a house this week. He's a real estate agent. I sold a house this week for cash. And he said, it was 559,000 or 589,000. He said, so I asked the guy for proof of purchase, proof of funds that he could do it. So he sent it to me, but what he sent me was August's checking account statement. And there was 6.8 million in that checking account. But he said, Barry, the reason I'm calling you, in August alone, in that one LLC, limited liability company, $121 million came in and went out purchasing homes in one city. This 2 days later, a friend that I grew up with, she texted me and told me, thank you for doing this, Barry, about the book, just bringing it to people's attention, because she said, my son and his wife, okay, they both have good jobs. They cannot afford homes. And just this week, there's a housing division between Salt Lake and where we both grew up. It's about 20 miles away, and we're 30 miles away, you know, from where we grew up. The place was called Stansbury Park. She said there were 8 homes for sale. And in one day, corporation came in and bought 6 of them in one day. And when I was writing the book, Google's AI and Microsoft's AI picked up that I'm writing about buying homes for cash. I was having ads thrown at me, 20, 30 of them a day, of young people using. You could tell it was the same group behind it because it was the same script, just mixed up a little. I'll buy your house for cash. You don't have to clean anything, okay? You don't have to pay real estate agent commissions, nothing. You just tell me, we'll have your cash, okay? Give me a call, well, a person from my team, blah, 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 blah. These are nominees for these funds. That's why $120 million goes through account in 1 month. The danger is this, and I don't think people realize what's going on. If you are a young person and you can no longer afford rent or to buy a home, you're a slave to your landlord. They're destroying democracy in this country as we know it. A friend of mine here in Las Vegas, we met and had lunch a couple of months ago. We're going to build homes. It's called BA Homes, Building Affordable Homes for America. We were having lunch and talking about doing this. The server, because we were talking for an hour and a half, 2 hours, the server, nice guy in his mid-30s, he finally asked, are you guys talking about building affordable homes in Las Vegas? When I said yes, it was like a dam of emotion broke in this young man. He just broke open. He said, that's needed so badly. My rent has doubled in 6 years. It was $800 a month. It's $1,600. I'm working 2 jobs. My wife's working. We've got 2 children. We can't afford to do half of what we did because $1,000 that we were making before, that's where we went for entertainment and clothing and food.
Barry, the real estate moguls that we're talking about, the BlackRocks, the Blackstones, and some of the private names, they care as much about affordable housing as J.P. Morgan Jr. cared about peace. They're interested. They're not thinking about the long-term effects of society and, like you said, enslavement of the renter, and then they become beholden to price increases, never owning anything. This actually extends to even condos and co-ops and people who are downsizing. I'm 65. People who are downsizing and going into these communities where who knows what the HOA fees are going to be in 5 years or what the real estate taxes are going to be. I personally am reluctant to sell. I like the idea of owning land. I have close to 1 acre of property, and I like the idea of owning land. You can see there are certain high net worth individuals, we don't have to go into them here, but really wealthy people and corporations that are buying up all the land that is, irrigation land near the rivers, part of the agriculture community. And, if their models tell them that this farm needs to get GMO ready crops, Roundup ready GMO crops, then that's what they're going to do, because we're actually feudalizing what people eat as well as where they live, right? And the healthcare that they get too. So this is becoming a feudalistic society on every level. I'm seeing it all develop right in front of our eyes. It's actually happening in plain sight. So real estate, home affordability, the food industry, the healthcare industry, all falling into the hands of these oligarchs that we've been talking about. And like you said, like we talked about, until and unless people experience enough pain, we can only pray that they hear the message, They
are, because what people need to do now, in my opinion, that's why I was so excited about Bobby Kennedy. Okay.
Right.
He was going after the problems.
Yeah. And that, by the way, the problems are both major, my opinion. The problems are both major parties. They give the appearance of, one side versus the other side. And there are some differences in their inherent philosophies. But the reality is it's a duopoly, and they're both engaged in the same feudalistic practices with their corporations and those that pay them off to fulfill their agendas.
Yeah.
Whereas Bobby Kennedy cannot be bought.
He can't. He just can't, because he's got he's got that personality and mentality. But if you go back and look at Graham Leach Bliley, everybody voted for that. Okay. Mm-hmm. Everybody, Democrats and Republicans, vote for the tax breaks for the wealthy. Right. They don't pass any bills that don't help the wealthy.
Exactly.
Okay. So what people have to do is in my opinion, put so much pressure. People don't think they make a difference. They do. If everybody listening to this, I tell them in the book, please read the book. I don't care. Go give it to 10 other people. You can buy one, loan it to everybody. just please call your representatives and tell them you want Glass-Steagall reinstated to get Wall Street out of our commercial banking, but we need a Glass-Steagall for housing also. Jeff Merkley from Oregon and John Adams from Washington, they introduced a bill that would do it last December, but it's sitting in committee. And Adams, he was there at Graham Leach Bliley, and he voted for it. Okay, so I don't believe he's sincere. He might be, and I hope he is, but he voted for Graham Leach Bliley, which destroyed all the protections FDR put in. Okay, if people will call their representatives and say, we want a Glass-Steagall for housing, we want funds out of housing, they can't own them. We need to put that kind of pressure on them, because if we don't, our children and our grandchildren, they're going to be hung. They are not going to know democracy like we've known it, because they will be slaves to their landlords. They simply can't afford land anymore. Plus the food is horrible.
I could not agree more.
GMOs. The ethanol companies I've done, they're now making what they call clean sugar, but it's made out of GMO. I said, look, if you're really going to do it, tell the farmers they have to deliver natural corn. The other thing people don't understand about GMO, anything that's GMO is neutered. The seeds cannot reproduce, so you have to buy it every month or every year from Monsanto again.
That is an entirely separate podcast, Barry, which we can have because I'm involved in that. We're part of a movement, Health Revolution USA. I'm doing a lot of work with a couple of other organizations as well. That's a major and immediate concern. The Farm Bill, for anyone, I'm going to end it with this. If you want to take action today, go to beyondpesticides.org and use the language they provide to tell your elected officials to oppose the proposed Farm Bill, which is before the Senate, one version in the Senate, one version in the House. They're due to vote on it next month. There are significant problems with that bill as it relates to our health and our children's health. And I'll leave it at that. And we do have to cut this off now, Barry. I'm so sorry, but we've run out of time.
It's been a pleasure to be on.
And it's been really great having you. I hope everyone gets to read your book, Wall Street's War on America. It's a great read. It's not only a great read, it's a fast read. You can read it in a couple of days or even less if you're really into it like I was, and enjoyable. I learned a ton reading your book, learning about J.P. Morgan, Herbert Hoover, FDR, and I love learning about that history because it really helps put things in perspective. So thank you so much for being here today, Barry. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. This was fun.